Welcome to the Education Investment Podcast. In a world where investors are looking for stable and growing long-term returns with social impact, the education sector is becoming increasingly attractive. We speak to leading educators, operators, and investors in the education sector around the world to explore this growing investment theme alongside our listeners. From preschools to K-12 schools to higher education and vocational education. From EdTech to education infrastructure. From VC investors to private equity and family offices, we explore it all. I'm your host, Monde Nkosi. Education has always been a big part of my life because my mother founded a school which was across the road from our home. I have benefited from excellent schools and teachers in South Africa and the US. I went on to study education and am now very grateful to be an investor in this sector that I love.
All opinions expressed by podcast guests are solely their own opinions. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Today, I am privileged to host Doug Becker for a conversation on investing and leading in higher education. We'll start off by exploring Doug's exceptional entrepreneurial journey, and we'll understand why he has chosen to dedicate so much of his career to higher education. Then we'll dive deep into investing and leading in higher education by discussing the companies that Doug has founded and led. We'll also discuss social impact and what he's excited about in the future of higher education. Doug is an absolute legend of the education sector. In 1983, he co-founded Sterling Partners, an investment firm headquartered in Chicago that has invested over $5.5 billion since inception, including into many education companies. In the early 1990s, Doug became chairman and CEO of Sylvan Learning and grew it into the largest K-12 tutoring company in North America, serving more than 200,000 students. In 1999, Doug founded Laureate Education and served as its CEO from founding until 2017. Doug grew Laureate into the largest higher education group in the world, serving more than 1 million students across more than 150 campuses in 29 countries. While Laureate has since reduced its scale and scope, it remains listed on the NASDAQ with a market capitalization of more than $3 billion. In 2019, Doug founded Cintana Education, a company that provides services to a wide range of higher education institutions around the world, and he is currently chairman of Cintana. Doug is also on the boards of Open Classrooms in France, Lecturio in Germany, as well as Dreamscape Learn and InStride in the US. He has also served on the boards of a range of nonprofit organizations, including Johns Hopkins Medicine and the International Youth Foundation. While I focus this introduction on Doug's many achievements in education, he also has entrepreneurial achievements in healthcare. In fact, Doug and his brother Eric sold their business Lifecard to Blue Cross back in 1985, and he decided to pass on a college or university education in order to pursue his entrepreneurial endeavors. Doug, that's one of the longest CVs I've had to do and introductions on this show. It's wonderful to have you on. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
So just as we start, we'd love to first start off learning about you and your journey. So a little bit about where you grew up and your family and your path ultimately into education.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, on the East Coast of the U.S., very close to Washington, D.C. And my father was an entrepreneur. He actually had a company that made Christmas decorations and designs for the shopping center industry. So that was kind of a fun household to grow up in, if you can imagine. Also, I learned a lot about a seasonal business where someone works all year only to deliver their entire annual revenue in a 30-day period. Maybe not an optimal business model, but a very interesting one to grow up around.
Were you ever Santa, Doug?
Yeah.
or an elf, perhaps.
My mother is a music expert and narrator for symphonic orchestras and very interesting and knowledgeable in the art and music world. And my brother, who you mentioned earlier, he and I have started our first business together when I was 17 years old. That was the healthcare business called Lifecard, where we came up with a model to automate medical records, along with two of our other close friends and a medical doctor who was our mentor. And that was a business that was launched in my high school year, kind of crazy, but I benefited from the wisdom of my older friends and my older brother. And then a few years later, the largest health insurance network in the U.S. called Blue Cross and Blue Shield bought that company from us. So really what I learned from that, Monde, is that I was very interested in the application of what we were developing and in the impact it would have on people's lives. My motivation for developing this technology to automate medical records was that I wanted to be a doctor. And I also was a computer hobbyist. And at that moment, this was at the very earliest days of the microcomputer. So most computer experts were mainframe experts or mini computer experts. And at that moment, a 17-year-old hobbyist for 1 minute in history could actually know as much as the real experts on computing because the technology had changed overnight. And what I learned from that was not that I had any exceptional skill, but that the intersection between technology and, in that case, medicine and healthcare, anybody would have known more than me about either healthcare or computing. But maybe in that moment, I was a little bit advantaged with the intersectionality of those two fields. So after that, I started thinking, because I loved the idea of the impact of what I was doing, I started thinking about whether there were any other industries. I didn't think that my edge would last very long, and it wouldn't have. But I started thinking about education as maybe a field even more impervious to technology at that time than healthcare. And actually, if you think about it, over the span of the 40 years since, which is staggering for me to imagine, in fact, you can imagine how many advances have been made in technology in healthcare, although it took probably 2 decades for a proper computerized medical record to be developed. But in education, much less advance until really the last 10 years. Even the term ed tech is really only a term of let's call it the last decade. So I switched horses from healthcare to education and have really spent my entire career ever since focused on the intersection of technology and education.
That is such a fascinating journey, Doug, and you've only just scratched the surface. There's so much depth that sits in all of those facets of your life. One of those that I'm interested in, and keeping it off the work a bit, I'll come back to the education. You mentioned that your mother was in music, which is something that I'm hearing for the first time. Has that carried over to you in any sense? Do you play any instruments? Are you involved in music in any sense?
It seems to have passed on to my 19-year-old son, who is a rock and roll star.
Oh wow! Okay.
A budding star.
Okay,
but not for me. But what I will say is, my mother is somebody who's exceptionally educated and cultured, and I learned so much from her. And I'd say the biggest story for my own education has been self-education. As you mentioned, since my business started and took off so early. I was 19 when we sold the first business and started looking for these education opportunities, and had been fortunate enough to apply and get into university, but decided to deferred a couple of years and then didn't go. What I learned from my mother, both of my parents went to university, but my mother really is somebody who's constantly educating herself. And I think that's really been my life story. In fact, one of the great moments for me when my daughter, who's now 24, applied to Georgetown, her application, when they asked, what would you do with your Georgetown education? Her essay was about education being something that you take and use and need, as opposed to something that somebody else gives you. And her story being really the story of what she'd witnessed with me as somebody that was more self-educated, but not uneducated. So the irony is, significant that I've ended up in the field of education. My kids both know that I don't hold out my own choice not to go to university as a path that I recommend for them or for anyone. Both of my daughter graduated from Georgetown. My son has just finished his first year at university here in Colorado. And so they know that my story was let's say, a strange circumstance and a wonderful one. And I hope what they really take from that is the lesson that my daughter wrote about, which is that they will have so many opportunities to continue and take their own education out of life, out of reading, out of experiences, and not expect that it's just what you get when you sit in the classroom.
That's wonderful. And you're living evidence of that. I am interested to hear, though, did your parents fall off their chair when you told them you weren't going to go to university? And I understand your brother did the same as well. Put us in that moment.
My brother was in his last semester of university at University of Chicago. And one of my other partners, who I'm still in business with all these years later, a very dear friend, was in his last semester at Johns Hopkins University. All of my partner's parents and my parents fell out of their chairs to think that we were going to do this. I'll never forget, my father was on a business trip in New York, and he knew I was working on this project. He was helping me. He let me use his office. He lent me a suit to wear, a 3-piece suit back then. And, but he didn't realize that the project was about to launch. And he called me from the train station in New York, and he said, "Son, you're on the front page of the New York Times. What are you doing?"
Is that the article from 1985?
Yes. And
I saw that one.
And I really, for that to be, top of the fold, front page of the New York Times in 1985, was really very, very unusual. And, he was excited, but then my mother and my father said to me, so by then I had applied to university, and, they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to apply for a deferment." And, which I did. And, then I got another deferment. By then I was, trying to, matriculate into Harvard, which had accepted me. And then, after a couple of years, because the business was going, so I couldn't just leave it. After a couple of years, Harvard wrote me and they said, I'll never forget this. First, they said, letter, Douglas R. Becker, not my middle initial. So I thought, okay, there must be many Douglas Beckers out there. But Douglas R. Becker, you need to now, either come to university or reapply next year. And it never happened, for me, but it was a remarkable experience, and I never took from it that I was too good for university or anything like that. It was, my view, in all sincerity, was there was a 0% chance that this venture was going to work. I was starting it at 17 years old. How could it work? My incredibly wise 21-year-old brother was advising me, and how could any of this work? It just was so unlikely, but it did. And to our amazement, a couple years later, Blue Cross made us the proverbial offer we couldn't refuse. A great example of my brother's wisdom. I remember saying to my brother and my partners, I didn't want to sell this business. To me, it wasn't a business. It was about a product. It was about a card you could carry in your wallet. And there were at that time, I think maybe 60 million people with Blue Cross and Blue Shield coverage in America. And my dream was all of those people, when they went to any doctor's appointment, they would pull their Blue Cross card out. It had an optical coating on the back, and they would be able to access their medical records. The idea that we would make money from this was of no importance to me. I wanted this product to live. And so I said to my partners, I don't want to sell. And I had been the founding person to come up with this idea, and they were very supportive of me. But my brother took me aside and he said, "Doug, I don't think you're seeing the whole equation. On the one hand, they're making us this very generous offer to buy our business. On the other hand, they are funding our business. And so if they were to stop with one hand funding our business, there is no business. So maybe there's something a little bit more, sinister if we don't take their offer." And whether that would have been the case or not, his logic was impeccable. And we decided really they had been generous. They had funded everything in the project and ultimately made us a generous offer to acquire our company. And in fact, even today, 40 years later, I'm still on health insurance policy from Blue Cross and Blue Shield. So they treated us very well Monday.
Wow, and leading on, exactly from that. So you've done a lot in your career, a lot in your life, in healthcare, in other areas, in investing, but higher education really sticks out. You've had such a huge impact in higher education, built what was, as I mentioned in your intro, to my knowledge, the largest higher education group ever been created, over 1 million students. Why have you chosen to focus specifically on higher education and spend so much of your career there?
Sure. Well, in the beginning, my first education company that I found, which I think might be amusing to everyone, I'd set myself out to look at the intersection of education and technology, and I found a little company that made training systems for word processing and for Morse code training, if you can imagine. Now I have to explain to my kids because, of course, everybody knows what Morse code is, but Morse code is not even used anymore except in movies. So this company made a simulator, a computerized simulator, that if you wanted to train a somebody to use a word processor at the time, the dedicated computing word processors from many brands. You could just swap out the keyboard from a digital word processor to an IBM word processor to at the time, Wang Technologies word processor, all of these old computer systems that don't even exist anymore. And we also made a Morse code training system where our customer was the Coast Guard. So that was the intersection. That was the changeover from healthcare into education. Very quickly, we stumbled across Sylvan Learning Centers. You mentioned Sylvan, the tutoring business, which had a chain of about, at the time, I want to say maybe 100 franchised tutoring centers where kids would go after school for tutoring. So this was my entry into education, but not into higher education. And really by then I was beginning to get some business skills and maybe some confidence, as to what I could do besides, being a mediocre coder with computers, and started being really, really fascinated because I would go sit in these Sylvan centers. Fascinating to work with a franchise business because, we're talking today about entrepreneurship. Franchisees are really wonderful entrepreneurs. They're following somebody else's system, but they're entrepreneurs. I spent a lot of time with the franchisees. I became the CEO of this company. It was a $10 million revenue company. So to me, that seemed really big. And I started really seeing that parents were making choices about the education of their child. If they wanted their kid to do better in school, they could bring them to us after school. If they wanted their kid to get accelerated beyond other kids, they could do the same. But many of our kids came to us because they weren't doing well in school. And we had a fantastic model to improve their education. And it worked. And so we grew the Sylvan Centers to 1,000 locations, to 250,000 students, to I think at our peak, we might have had about 50,000 teachers who after school would come teach for us. And this is the bridge into higher education, which I'll mention in just a moment. We took the company public in 1993. I might have been the youngest CEO of a publicly traded company at that time. Of course, now I see so many gifted entrepreneurs at such early ages who've done so much more than I have done. But at the time, it was kind of unheard of. And it was exciting and we had a very mission driven mentality. Many of our franchisees were teachers. So like me, making money wasn't the only or even the first thing that they were thinking about. And that, Monday, is a very important theme in my life. And I think it has helped me thrive in education because education, it is a business, but there are aspects of it that are more important than any business in the same way that it would be in healthcare. And you can't treat it just as a maximizing of profitability or you're not going to last very long in this business. So that was really helpful to me. As we went public, higher education started coming to mind because in trying to attract and retain these 50,000 part-time teachers, we came up with the idea of offering them a master's degree that would be optimized to the part-time need of a teacher. And back then, there really wasn't traditional online education. So we acquired a company that made a correspondence program, essentially, of mailing videotapes back and forth and having correspondence with the teachers. It sounds so archaic to even say it. But we ended up with thousands of teachers, and we worked with universities that would accredit or validate and offer a degree, a master's degree to these students. Well, this just took off, and we started getting inquiries from other teachers that weren't working for us that wanted our master's degree because it had been optimized in this very, I think, effective way. And at the same time, I stumbled across this private university in Spain, where there were two partners that were kind of fighting with each other, and they were prepared to consider selling that university. And we acquired that university and then very quickly acquired a university in the US called Monde University in order to be able to accredit our own teacher education programs. Walden went on to become just a significant, major leader in online education. When we acquired them, they had about 1,000 students, mostly doctoral students. But they were fully accredited, one of only 3 universities in the U.S. that were fully accredited without a campus. So these were early days. At that point, it wasn't even permitted by the Department of Education to offer a fully online degree. So we had this hybrid correspondence online model. Then we convinced the government to launch a pilot program for fully online degrees. And our reward for that is that they picked only 25 universities, most of which were kind of famous American universities, plus us, Walden. And then the Spanish university that we acquired became what ultimately became the core of Laureate, where we saw Spain as part of Europe. but deeply linked into Latin America. And we started building a model for how a university, really, I would call it an operating system for how a university could be, let's say, more innovative and nimble and student-centered. And we developed these pillars of kind of an ideology framework for how we thought a university could be more successful. Again, ironic since I had never gone, but I surrounded myself with some amazing experts, including a legendary higher education expert named Joe Duffy. Joe had been the chancellor of University of Massachusetts and the president of American University, had also been with the State Department and the U.S. government. And I remember asking Joe to join us. And he said to me, you need to understand, I need to give my resignation to the president of the United States, who at that time was President Clinton. And then he came and joined, Joe Duffy came and joined us as well. So that was the pivot Monday into higher education. And then that Spanish university, Universidad Europea, became the largest private university in Spain. Today, they have about 50,000 students, just tremendous, thriving university. Walden today would also have about 50,000 students. After I left, when Laureate divested those particular universities, they were amongst I'd say the largest and most successful private universities really in the world. Each of them in the, call it hundreds of millions of revenue and multi-billion-dollar valuations for these universities. So I was really, really proud of what we accomplished. But Laureate at its peak had 70 universities in 29 countries, including 9 universities that we started from scratch. So I'll just pause there.
Sure. It's a whirlwind. I mean, you've done so much over the course of your career. Even just following it as you're talking about it is honestly quite extraordinary.
It's exhausting,
before you
just hearing about
it. It's lovely. It's energizing. Quite the opposite. No, you by the time you're 20, you've started and sold a business in healthcare. You touched on then moving on to Sylvan and taking that from 100 tutoring centers to 10,000 tutoring centers.
1,000.
1,000 was the number, and 50,000 teachers. That was it.
Yeah.
And being one of the youngest CEOs of a listed business after the IPO in 1993, and on then into Laureate. And the nugget for me that was most important in everything that you said there, and what attracted you to work in education, is that it goes beyond the commercial. There are many industries and ways to make money out there, and this is one where it goes beyond the money, and it's part of why I'm involved in this sector. I believe it's at the root of so much of human opportunity at an individual level. It's played a huge role in my life, my parents' life, my grandmother's life, and it's also at the root of so much progress within families. So I entirely identify with what you're saying. If I ask one question, I'll come back to some of the detail on both Sylvan and Laureate. But if I just take a step back, that career trajectory I've gone through, and there's even more that you've achieved than that. For someone looking from far away, a career like that can look like it's just uniformly upwards. It's just it looks easy almost from far. But we all know life is not like that, and there's complexity. So just I'd love to hear about just any one challenge that you'd want to pick up on. It could be through childhood, it could be through your career, and what you think some of the lessons are that holds for some of the younger entrepreneurs or professionals out there.
Well, I want to say the very first story I mentioned, that company that I was laughing a little bit about that was teaching word processing and Morse code. Yes. I think it's actually an incredible example of how hard it can be to be an entrepreneur. My partners and we went to acquire this very small business. If I remember right, I want to say it was about $3 million of revenue. And we acquired the business. I think we took over maybe like the 3rd of January or something. On the 3rd of January, I show up as the proud now vice president. I'm going to be vice president. My partner, Chris, is the other vice president. I was going to be vice president of marketing, Chris, vice president of product development. And my mentor at the time, not the medical doctor, but another mentor, a wonderful executive named John Robertson. He was the CEO. I knew at that time I was, maybe 20. I was not old enough to really be a CEO of anything. So interesting. My partners and I owned a business, and we worked for someone else in the business because we were really open to learning and knew our limitations. What was interesting is we show up, and the first thing is I go into a meeting with the sales force. I'm the marketing leader, and there are 2 people there. And I said, tell me about your work. And one says, well, I'm in charge of the western half of the United States. And the other says, I'm in charge of the eastern half of the United States. Thinking that's not a very robust model. And I said, how are we doing? Do you have any concerns? And they said, yes, on January 1, our our GSA services contract, which is how you could sell into the U.S. government, expired. And so we had bought the company.
Oh, goodness.
The people that owned it probably thought that we were going to renew this license. And we thought that they had renewed this license. And I was 20 and let's just say my due diligence skills were not, phenomenal. And half of our revenue was gone the minute we bought the business.
Wow.
And then about 10 days later, we got a letter from a giant workforce company, a temporary services company called Kelly Services, massive company, still in existence today. They were our biggest customer outside of the government, the U.S. government, which the U.S. government was for things like the Coast Guard training and all that. And they sent us a note and they said, we believe that we had a right of first refusal to buy this company, whose technology is core to our training. And since that was not honored, we're terminating our contract with the company. So now we had lost, let's say, half of our remaining half. So within 2 weeks of buying this business, 75% of our revenue was gone. And that was the auspicious beginning to my first acquisition in education. And what did we do? We just ground it out. We gutted it out, worked through it, tried to keep optimism, went and saw, I will never forget going and visiting the executives at Kelly Services, and the meeting was postponed when I got there, and I was 20 years old. I just went to the movie theater and watched a movie, waiting for them to be available. The way today I might watch something on my phone, but at that time you'd have to go to a movie theater to do it. Went there and basically begged for them to reconsider terminating our contract, which eventually they did. There was litigation. I'd never been through that before. That was no fun. We eventually got reinstated on the GSA contract, and we just gutted it out. And eventually, that company called Key Systems was back on its feet and modestly profitable. And then we used that to acquire Sylvan and on and on and on. We went from there.
You must have an extraordinary tolerance for stress. I mean, to be honest, I'm stressed out just listening to this. There was the litigation. Was there also a warranty claim on the other side because of what happened with the expiry on the government side?
We never really felt that we had a good enough case. Or that there was the intentionality. And we felt a little bit of obligation on our own side to have, understood better what the heck we were doing. I will say I became, maybe a hard person to sell a business to after that because my trust levels just went down. Not because I thought anybody had misled us, but just I couldn't rely on anything. I needed to see evidence of everything. Probably a very good experience. Look, stress. I think my attitude then, as it was when I started the first business, was, I guess this will fail and I'll just go to college and then I'll have a career and I'll go work for somebody else. I didn't really think that failure was the end of the world. And I think that's important. Now, years later, I would actually say stress is harder for me now because I feel so responsible for the people that are counting on me. All the companies I've started in recent years or where I serve on a board, and I feel people are counting on me. And I'm not so worried that I will be hurt if something fails because I've done well over the years. I'm worried about the people that work for me, who are really betting their careers on the fact that what we do together is going to thrive and succeed. And I want them to be resilient and I want them to be realistic. And it's hard. What we're doing is difficult. It seems incredibly hard until you stop, lift your head up and look back and see how far you've come. And that's really been my experience. I'll just tell you one story to give you a sense of how hard it can be. That was so hard. Years later, we got past it. We have Sylvan. Sylvan seems to be thriving. We're a young public company. We were 18 million of revenue when we went public, which is just ridiculously too small. The company that took us public at the time, a very famous investment banking firm called Alex Brown in the US, they had just taken Microsoft and AOL public. So then our little
you're in wonderful company. I assume you got the best partner working on it then, yeah?
I actually did get a good partner. My banker ended up becoming a great banker in the education industry because of that, because of us, or because of his hard work, but because of the exposure with us. And so, but there was a time I was on vacation with my brother and some of his friends, and they said, "Well, how's it feel?" And it sounds so grim, but what I said to them is, I feel like every morning I go out to water the garden, but I'm literally watering the garden with my blood. That's the level of intensity, of passion, of pain and fear associated with being an entrepreneur in a venture. Because by then, a little bit later, I'm starting to have a family. I'm starting to have the concern about all the people dependent upon me, all of our franchisees in the Sylvan business, all the people buying shares in our company. This is not easy to to take this kind of responsibility. So I would say stress comes with the package. Every once in a while I read about people who seem like everything they touch just turns to gold. And I think to myself, boy, it never worked that way for me. And we had some literal failures, companies that we invested in that went out of business. We started a company called Caliber Learning. I think we took it public very briefly in 1997. MCI, the telephone company competing with AT&T, invested a lot of money to support us starting that company. At the time, we wanted to do online executive education from famous universities like Wharton, for example, at University of Pennsylvania. And there wasn't bandwidth to do it online. This is 1997. So we actually built out a retail network of studios where students could come physically and sit in a classroom and be connected through satellite with live lectures from universities. Great idea. But 2 years later, suddenly there's a quadrupling of bandwidth and the very beginnings of actual streaming video, which didn't work very well at the time. But the writing was almost instantly on the wall that venture was, let's say we were too early or too late, depending on how you look at it. So my point is it's the aggregate of all of these things. And a great reminder to me, Monde, an expression that I love, which is that experience is what you get when you were expecting something else. And so all of these things that were harder, I learned from. That's a lot of my education, was learning from the things that didn't work and applying those lessons to things that ultimately became more successful because of it.
That's wonderful, Doug. I took a lot of lessons from there, both in your approach towards starting something new and not being afraid of failure, but not also being blasé, that you have a huge responsibility, the people that are coming along with you, the investors that are coming along with you. And it's the first time I've ever heard someone say they were watering the garden with their blood, to talk about the sense of responsibility.
I have a feeling that it will be some entrepreneur watching this video who's going to know exactly what I mean.
Exactly what you're saying. 100%. No, that's lovely. And thanks for sharing so openly as well about your journey and some of the challenges. I think as we move forward then, because you've touched a bit on Sylvan and, as we come to your time in higher education, I'd love to focus a bit on both Laureate and Cintana and then what you're excited about in the future of education, higher education, because you're involved in a lot of things and technology and AI, etc. So let's start then with Laureate. Talk to me about what your vision was from, starting with Walden and the Spanish University, which you touched on, what you wanted to create. And, when I think to most universities, most people think of, a single site. What was the benefit here to being in a group? Why have all of these?
So the original business plan I wrote, and this is what put us on the search to find the Spanish university. We didn't know it was going to be in Spain, but we were going to find a university to acquire. And the idea was to build a global network. So you've captured it already. That part of what we had in mind was a network. It wasn't just about each university individually being successful, but a network. And part of the vision for this, Monde, came from another company my partner Chris and I had started called Prometric, which is today still existing, a very major testing company that does secure examinations at that time and even today for exams like the GMAT to get into business school or the TOEFL to get into the U.S. university system at all, and many, many other tests, nurse licensing, doctor licensing, things like that. And so we were doing this testing and we were building testing centers around the world to allow people to gain admission to U.S. universities because they had to pass these tests to get into university. And I just was astonished at how many people around the world wanted to get into a U.S. university. I remember being in China and going into a meeting in the U.S. Embassy, and it happened to have been at a time when the U.S. during the Balkans Wars had accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in one of the Balkan, maybe Kosovo. I don't remember which country, Bosnia maybe. And so U.S.-China, very hot situation. And I walk up to the U.S. Embassy, and on the one side are people demonstrating against America. This is in Beijing. And on the other side is a line of literally 1,000 people waiting to apply for their visa to come to the United States. By the way, that is very, very much resonates with where we are today. The world's complicated. Yeah. Let's say U.S. and international relations are fraught in a way. And yet I believe there will still be, hundreds of thousands, millions of people that will aspire to what the U.S. can offer as a country, as a philosophy, and with the quality of higher education. So I came away with that. That's what gave me the idea when I started thinking for every person that can afford to come to the U.S. for their education, there must be 100 that would like that kind of high quality education if they could get it in their home country at the much lower cost that would be implied. So I wrote this business plan called Sylvan International Universities. So I'm running Sylvan, but I'm, an entrepreneur. I'm writing this business plan and I take it to our board. And I said, I think we could go acquire 10 universities around the world and grow them each to 50 million of revenue. This would be a $500 million revenue business. At that point, the whole of Sylvan and Prometric was maybe 200 million. So we were growing. We were doing well from that 18 million when we went public, but nothing like what this had in mind. Well, instead, we ended up acquiring not 10 universities, but 60 plus and starting 9 universities. And they grew on average to be much larger. And therefore, we had individual universities that would have been $600-700 million of revenue. And Laureate got to about $5 billion of revenue. So that idea, the Sylvan International University's business plan, made a lot of sense. Eventually, we needed to focus on it. We divested the tutoring business. So then we couldn't use the Sylvan name anymore and renamed the company Laureate in, I think, 2003. And then that business, we sold Prometric to raise money to fund this business. We sold Sylvan to do the same. And now we're just in higher education. We're in 2003. We've renamed the company. We announced this plan because we were a small conglomerate of different types of education businesses. Our stock was the highest volume traded stock on the NASDAQ the day that we announced that we were divesting all these things in order to focus in this new promising business. And that was very, very exciting. And then it just took off. And by 2007, so 4 years later, Laureate, only higher education, surpassed $1 billion of revenue. In fact, it happened so fast that I remember I actually missed it. Like the moment that we became $1 billion in annualized run rate revenue, you'd think that would have somehow popped up on my phone, like on some accelerometer or whatever it would be. And no, not at all. And it took us like months later until my CFO came to me and he said, Doug, we just passed $1 billion in run rate.
This wasn't Enron with the share price in the lift or in the lift lobby.
Famously said. No Enron analogies here. But yes. So that was the point. And it's actually a very good point that you make. The point was we were a public company. We had to pay attention to that. Again, I just want to say making money was an outcome of doing a good job with all the other things, building a good culture, delivering a high quality service, being accountable for outcomes and results, measuring the impact on what we did. Ultimately, we did then take the company private because we'd gotten very large, and I started to see a timidity on my board. I had an excellent board, but I think the pressure as a public company actually, I think, impacted my board more than it impacted me. So I had a plan that we needed to now move from what was a primarily Latin American-based business and we had the U.S. with Walden. We needed more in Europe where we had Spain, but I thought we needed to be global. In fact, one day I saw a business plan that somebody had written at that time saying, they wanted to be the Laureate of Asia. And I looked at the map for Asia and I see, Southeast Asia alone is as big as all of Latin America. And that is not including China, India, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, like all of these huge markets.
I can simply imagine your response there, that we are the Laureate of Asia.
Exactly. I'm saying there is no way that I'm going to let somebody else be the Laureate of it. Like I didn't start this to be the Laureate of Latin America. I wanted to be, no, the irony is now today Laureate has decided to refocus on Latin America and they're doing spectacularly. And it's just a totally different strategy. And with my, support. And very, very fond of the people there, including their very gifted CEO, who was my CFO at the time. And his vision was, let's consolidate today down into only 2 countries. Laureate today, in just its last 2 countries, is $1.5 billion of revenue. As you said, about $3 billion of market cap. I mean, just a powerhouse in those 2 countries of Mexico and Peru. I'm really proud of what they've done. But for me, the network was important. And I'll transition in a moment to sort of how that became Cintana, but I want to just pause there and see if you have any other direction you want to take it.
Again, so much there and really fascinating, and actually areas where our paths have crossed at times. So your network of universities touched pretty much every corner of the globe, including right here in South Africa. Yes. So you owned Monash, which you know very well, and Monash was then acquired by Advitech, and I was on the board of Advitech for quite a long period. So areas where the paths cross, and some mutual people in that as well.
I have to just tell you very briefly on that, Monde, sorry to interrupt you, is I loved that we were in South Africa. For me, I've always wanted to do more in Africa. always wanted to see more economic development so that people who could graduate from universities could have jobs. And, there's this very tough cycle where if you have great college graduates, it should help build workforce and the economy. But if the economy is lagging, you have high unemployment of college graduates. So that was very hard, harder in Africa, I think, than any place I've ever worked. But Monash, South Africa, I thought was just exceptionally an exceptional institution and inspiring, expensive by African standards, but I thought remarkably inexpensive in terms of the quality of what we were delivering. The then vice chancellor of Monash Australia, who was our partner, who is now in Saudi Arabia as the head of KAUST, which is the most prestigious university in Saudi Arabia, Ed Byrne, very good friend of mine. And we worked really closely on that, and I did enjoy spending time. We had an incredibly gifted CEO of Africa for Laureate named Esther Benjamin. I don't know if you ever ran across Esther, very, very good friend who's now herself the CEO of a very successful education company. So
that's wonderful. The only part I didn't like about your entire description of the path was when you made the GMAT reference, which took me back many years now before I went to Stanford of having to get down and do GMAT all those years ago.
You probably took the GMAT at one of our parametric testing centers.
At one of your centers. Exactly. I was thinking that as you were going.
I will tell you, by the way, one of my great funny memories, only in retrospect, is my wife once told me that we had gotten a call at our home because somebody had failed their pilot licensing exam, which we also did that exam in the US. And they were, it sounds terrible, they were calling to threaten me if I couldn't help them pass their pilot licensing. We were delivering 9 million exams a year. I was, the CEO of a parent company. I was not involved in any of that. And somebody decided to track me down and threaten me. So I just want to thank you for not reaching out to me over your problems with the
It's GMAT. Simply because I wasn't resourceful enough to find the number of the ultimate CEO of this entity. and I'd love to move on then to Cintana and understand post, as you said, Laureate remains a one of the largest higher education institutions in the world, and enjoyed that. And then you decide after that to found Cintana. So what's your vision for Cintana?
Well, I want to pick up on a couple of the threads, and then I'll tell you how it happened. I want to say there is a theme in here that's really important, which is our history of partnering with nonprofit or public institutions. So a side project at Laureate, which was one of my favorite projects, we partnered with University of Liverpool to help them open a branch in China. And I was living in Hong Kong, building out Laureate Asia because, of course, we were going to be Laureate Asia. And I got a call from a friend who was the vice chancellor of University of Liverpool saying that they had been asked to open a university in China. And he said, look, Doug, something to the effect of, the people who built University of Liverpool all died 100 years ago. We don't know how to build a new university. That's not what we do. Well, how do we do it? And we partnered with them and helped them build what became the largest branch of any Western university anywhere in the world, which today is called the Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University, 27,000 students. Why do I mention it? Because we were partnered with a public institution. We brought this unbelievable experience, that all this operating system, framework, technology, way of looking at markets, people around the world. We had 80,000 employees at Laureate, and including in China, and yet we were representing somebody else's brand and culture and mission and beliefs. And that was University of Liverpool. And we learned how to be a good partner. We learned how to listen, to understand them deeply. And I loved that partnership. And I had really learned that from our work with Educational Testing Service, ETS, which is the owner of the GMAT exam. Well, actually, they are the operator of the GMAT exam. And they own the TOEFL exam, and they own the GRE exam and other exams in the kind of that public, let's say, governmental admissions exams industry. And so Prometric, this very successful company that we built and sold, was partnered almost entirely with Educational Testing Services, a large nonprofit institution, I should mention today, run by Amit Sevak, a Laureate alum. So incredibly amazing that, I started Prometric with my partner Chris in the 90s. Our partner was ETS. We partnered daily. I used to drive back and forth from Baltimore almost every week to Princeton, New Jersey, to ETS. And then we built our business in partnership with them. And we learned how to partner well with nonprofit institutions because we were so mission driven and they trusted us. So that's the backdrop. And one of the things that happened at Laureate when we were bringing in investors is that the IFC came in as an investor into Laureate, the IFC being the private arm of the World Bank. I was so proud to have them as an investor. And that's another form of sort of validation of mission orientation and the balancing of making money and doing good for the world. So that's the backdrop. I announced I'm retiring from Laureate, not because I wanted to retire, but because I'd been there 20 years. It was a big company, and I still think of myself as an entrepreneur more than I'm not the optimal leader to run a $5 billion revenue company. I only was able to do it because I surrounded myself with such gifted people. And that's what makes me most proud. I think that really made my success. And I'm so happy to have had the relationships that I do with so many people around the world in this industry. And I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. And we announced my retirement. Laureate pivoted in this new direction, as I mentioned. And I got the most remarkable email from President Michael Crow of Arizona State University, somebody that I had known for a long time, admired as, I think, just a singular leader in higher education, really, in the world, who has presided over the past 22 years over the transformation of Arizona State from a large and let's say not prestigious, but large and good university into a much more prestigious, but now the largest university in the United States, 180,000 student public university that also is ranked in the top 1% of all universities in the world. That's a hard thing to do. At Laureate, we were big. We had 1 million students. We could have never been ranked in the top 1%. That would be to be in the top 200 of all of the global rankings around the world. Never going to happen. You would need research. You would need a high grade faculty. You would need funding sources to develop. And so Michael wrote me, and he said, in a nutshell, two things that haunt me to this day. One, he said, Doug, if you had Arizona State as your partner when you started Laureate, what would you have done differently? And then he wrote underneath of that, whatever you do next, come do it with us. So what an invitation. I got on a plane. I spent a week just looking at understanding, just trying to understand. I think in a week, I probably figured out 5% of what Arizona State was doing. That since then, I think I've now gotten to 85% after 6 years. And I would say that makes me like a PhD in understanding Arizona State because it's so dynamic, constantly changing, so large, doing so many interesting things. And indeed, that's what we did. We created what I would have done with Laureate if I'd had Arizona State as my partner, meaning having access to their brand and curriculum and technology, AI, research capacity. But we also have what we were able to do, like I did with Laureate, unbelievably gifted operators around the world in many countries, so that when we decide, for example, we're just launching a new university in Pakistan, where we've partnered with local investors who have obtained a national license to open a university in Pakistan, which required an act of parliament. And we bring to them Arizona State, the brand, the technology, the curriculum, and the operational experience. For Laureate and Cintana, this would now be, I think, maybe my 13th new university that we've started. We've opened more than 20 new medical schools around the world. We just have all this experience. So that's what we're doing with Cintana. We're in 30 countries, startup universities in some countries like Pakistan and Uzbekistan, and soon, I hope, in Saudi Arabia, where we're doing a lot. And then also working with existing universities that want to be kind of accelerated or supercharged by teaming with us in Arizona State. And we go to market together. If people want what we offer from Arizona State and they go there, Arizona State will say, that's why we created Cintana. And ASU, through their private arm, is a shareholder in Cintana. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're doing.
That's phenomenal. And this expansion of public institutions from a single country going around the world, I mean, it's had a huge impact over the last 2 or so decades in expanding access to quality education in other parts of the world, without people having to leave their homes at age 17 or 18 and fly halfway across the world. So it's a huge trend, big trend. I think there's still a long way for it to play out. And as you know, we'll be watching from the sidelines, supporting you on this journey. I know that you do have some time pressures. I could go on until tomorrow. There's still so many other topics, AI and technology, so many others. But I know that I do have to bring us to a close, and perhaps we can get you for a second episode down the line and discuss some of those companies you're on the boards of, for instance, and technology, etc. But just as I bring it to a close, I come back to you, Doug, and I ask the same concluding questions to to all of our guests. And that's simply, please tell us about your favorite teacher or educator.
Wonderful. I had so many. But in particular, I will talk about Mr. Carr, Tom Carr, who was my French teacher in 7th or maybe 8th grade. And I think it was 8th grade, because I had another very good French teacher in 7th grade. And Mr. Carr opened my eyes to the world by speaking so passionately about French language and culture. Because of him, I ended up going to a homestay and living in France, becoming at the time moderately capable of speaking the language, but more importantly, just loving what I learned of the world. And it wasn't just France. I went and lived with a Moroccan family that were recent immigrants to France. And honestly, I would say my just hunger to learn about other countries and my passion to try to contribute between countries and across countries and not just in the U.S. Really emanates from his passion and his excellent teaching. So I wrote him maybe 10 years ago to just tell him how important he had been to me and how much I appreciated him amongst many mentors that I've had in my life. I do know, since we're going to wrap up, I also want to say, Monde, you were nice enough to say you're going to watch from the sidelines. I still want to do more in Africa. So maybe come onto the field and let's figure out something we can do together to bring some of our ideas to a part of the world that is going to have it's going to be the demographic growth driver in the world, and also a place in which young people will most need the kind of life-changing experience that higher education can bring.
Absolutely critical at an individual level, in families, and if we look at our societies as a whole. Here in South Africa, much was made this year in the press that we had 300,000 applicants for one university that has 10,500 first-year slots, one of our big public universities. So huge supply-demand imbalance, and it's one of the problems of our time. We need to solve it if we are to become successful countries. So, Doug, thank you so much for the time that you took today. I really appreciate it, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Learned a lot about you that I didn't know over the course of today's conversation, and really appreciate you taking the time.